So, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this webinar, which is part of our Arts and Culture programme at the Asia Scotland Institute. And we will be looking at the syncretic culture of India's monumental architectural heritage and the conservation of heritage townscapes in India. For those of you that may not already know this, syncretism is a union or attempted fusion of different religions, cultures, or philosophies. Like, for example, in the West, Halloween, which has both Christian and pagan roots, or the combination of Aristotelian philosophy with the belief system of the early punk rock practitioners. So that's your background briefing on that. And it's now my immense pleasure to be able to welcome Sunita Kohli, who is a great friend and the president of K2India, an award-winning firm of architects and designers, whose co-founder and CEO is the architect Kohelika Kohli. In 1992, Sunita was conferred the Padma Shri for contribution to national life in the field of interior design and architectural conservation. And since 1971, she's worked as a research-based interior designer and is a manufacturer of fine contemporary and classical furniture. Since '82, she's considered a reputed leader in historical interior architectural restoration, and her professional portfolio is significant. Sunita is also a member of the International Advisory Council of the Asia Scotland Institute. Lord Charles Bruce is active in the not-for-profit sector in conservation, the fine arts, and multiculturalism. He manages a family estate in Fife as a sustainable rural business centered on Broomhall House, a leading travel destination and events venue. He's a director of the Asia Scotland Institute and chairs the Kolkata Scottish Heritage Trust. So on that note, I would like now to hand over to Lord Charles Bruce to help us start the proceeding.
Thank you very much, Roddy. This is an enormous subject and we don't have very much time. I believe there are something like 50,000 important monuments in India. So obviously our slideshow is only going to address a selection of the most important. And we've broken the subject down into four topics. And I think we'll really be starting really at the beginning of, if you like, the European connection with Indian civilization. In the 19th century, British archaeologists, who, if you like, began to codify and to classify Indian archaeology. And I think Sunita was going to put up some slides to introduce this topic.
Yes, we'll start. Roddy, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Prejudiced, of course, but thank you. We'll start with the I start with one of our oldest sites here because it also illustrates what was happening in the 19th century as far as conservation was concerned. As we know, but I just reiterated that conservation in India really began in about the mid-19th century, and Cunningham is considered the father of the Archaeological Survey of India. So it was sites like this that was Sanchi, and sites like Sarnath, which are old Buddhist sites. And Sarnath is incidentally where the Buddha gave his first sermon, they were all covered under mounds and mounds of mud, and which were then retrieved, and now they are major World Heritage Sites.
Sunita, I think it's worth pointing out that Cunningham was one of a number of Scots who were
yes.
at the forefront of making these really important discoveries. I think there are at least five. We have Colin Mackenzie, who was active in the 18th and early 19th centuries as a first surveyor general. Cunningham himself arrives as a teenager. in Bengal as an engineer, and he had been sponsored by Walter Scott, the writer, from Dumfriesshire.
Yes.
Yes, and so did the family of the successor, James Burgess.
Yes, it's interesting because, you know, Cunningham wasn't a trained archaeologist. He was an engineer, he was in the military, but with this major interest, which grew and grew and grew. And so he became the first Director General of ASI. And in India, he's considered the father of archaeology. What began, and of course, you know, it had a sort of a slightly checkered history till 1902, which when Curzon brought in John Marshall, and then began another very productive part of you know, archaeological sites that were being unearthed. So the 19th century, I think, not just in India but also abroad, has played a very important role in where archaeology got established. I think in the West also, with Ruskin and his book Seven Lamps of Architecture, and the differences that he was bringing in between restoration and conservation. But you know, and William Morris, who became his collaborator. But these were all academicians who were altruistic and who did not have personal agendas, which we'll come into later, of conservation and why some things need to be conserved and why some things need to be left outside the pale of conservation.
Perhaps Lord Curzon did have a personal agenda. I mean, his view was that Britain's greatest legacy to India, if you like, was in the conservation of its monuments. And that's something which was of very great personal importance to him.
Yes, in fact, I wanted to ask you, Charles, if I may, at this point. I mean, you have your great-grandfather was Viceroy in India from 1862 to 63. So since he was Viceroy, you know, Curzon also, he did a lot of good as far as conservation in India. So he will be remembered not just as a Viceroy to India, where he was controversial, but also as a person who really moved conservation forward in India. And yet he was a very controversial figure in Bengal and as well as in England. Would you like to tell us something about Lord Curzon and why this situation should have arisen?
Well, Curzon had 2 terms of office, which was quite unusual. Very few viceroys were given that chance. But his second term of office came to an abrupt end within its first year. People believe that is because of the controversy which resulted from the partition of Bengal. But really, it was because there was an argument with Lord Kitchener, who was obviously Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army. And that's why Curzon resigned in the end. It was unfortunately a monumental clash of egos, if you like.
Yeah, well, I'm on Curzon's side because Kitchener didn't really enjoy a very good reputation. So I hope I'm not hurting anybody there, because there's a role also he played in Egypt, but that's another story altogether, and a role that he played.
But Curzon continued to be interested in India after he returned to Britain, and continued to support the work of the ASI.
Yes, that's true. And also, after he had returned in 1905, after his term was finished, he was also very much against, if you remember, against the moving the capital from Calcutta to Delhi, because of expense and what it would mean to the position of Calcutta. And he was in many cases right, because of the First World War, what was envisaged as the initial budget rose up many hundreds of times more. So
yes, indeed. But I think he would have seen possibly as the most important legacy was the appointment of John Marshall
Yes.
as Director General, because by 1924, which was shortly after Curzon had died, Curzon wouldn't have been aware that Marshall was to make the greatest discovery, arguably,
Absolutely.
ever of the Indus Valley civilization, and also
Yes.
to introduce a new generation of Indian archaeologists.
Yes,
So I mean, Curzon
absolutely.
would have wanted to have taken, if you like, credit for that.
Yes, and it's also, you know, it's to his, I mean, he was to his credit, to Curzon's credit, that he picked up a John Marshall who was only 26, straight out of Cambridge, more or less, had studied the classics, and then brought him here. And he rose and rose and rose. And as you so rightly said, to John Marshall, we will always be indebted for Mohenjo-Daro and the Harappan civilization.
Sunita, do you think we should move on to the next topic at this point,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
begin to explore the pluralism of Indian society as referenced by its incredible architectural heritage? And I think you're going to be taking us to the city where you grew up, to Lucknow.
Yeah. Can you move it? I am. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. This is Lucknow. I was born in Lahore, grew up in Lucknow, and this is the Rumi Darwaza. And when we speak about patronage and enlightened patronage, I'd like to first start with the patronage of the fourth Nawab of Lucknow, Asif Ud-Daula, who was its greatest builder and who also moved the capital from Faizabad to Lucknow. And he built this gateway into, which was a gateway into Lucknow. And it's another matter for conservationists that there's so much heavy, vehicular traffic that is going through that that it is shaking the foundations and widening the cracks. So for 20 years that I know of, the State Archaeology Department has been speaking with various stakeholders, but nothing has moved forward. Whether it's bureaucratic apathy or whether there is not the desire really to sincerely work at what is really a magnificent structure. And it's called Rumi Darwaza, or this whole part of Lucknow is called the Istanbul of the East. Actually, it was called the Constantinople of the East. And it's because of this gate, which is similar to a gate in Istanbul, the Babu Humayun. Now, this is, the style of this is Indo-Saracenic. And then I move to this magnificent, complex, the Bada Imam Bada, where you see the mosque, you see the entrance, and you see the terrace of the Bhul Bhulaiya. And this was, now, Asif Ud-Daula, here I'd like to say about the sort of, because we're speaking of patronage and how enlightened and that patronage was, and it was pluralistic and it was secular. This was a project that was built because there had been a terrible famine in Awadh, UP, Uttar Pradesh, and this was a food for work program. So it was built, and of course that many of his 20,000 of his subjects were employed. They used to get paid, fed, everything. And Asif Ud-Daula, this Nawab, the fourth Nawab, as I said, it is ironical that this beautiful complex has now been struck off the state list of the tourism list by the present chief minister. And it is yet to be restored on the tourism booklet. And because it's evidently because it's a Islamic monument. But the irony is that that same Nawab who built this also donated the land which in Gorakhpur for the temple complex, of which the present chief minister is the chief priest. So these are the ironies of conservation. And I think conservation must stay outside the pale of politics. And I've used this particular example, as also was the Taj Mahal struck off the list. I mean, if one can imagine, one of the 7 wonders of the world. But the whole of India knows about it. There was public protests, and then it has been reinstated. But so that has happened. It has not happened with this building.
Sunita, this leads us on, I think, to the third topic, where we wanted to focus very much on this aspect of Indian civilization, which is so unique, and that is the core religious and spiritual purpose of so many of the really important monumental buildings in India. And I'm obviously concerned, as others are in the United Kingdom, that these really important Islamic sites have been struck off. But I just wonder if you'd like to broaden out the discussion at this point to remind us of the, if you like, the parity between Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic, Sikh, and Christian buildings, which India has this incredible collection.
Yes, because you know buildings always played a very important role in what they represented. Because they were statements of empire. So whatever was the religion of the ruler, whether if he was Hindu, the magnificent temples have been built, of which really there are few equivalents in the world. We have several. I'm going to show these slides to you very quickly.
Yeah.
So these are in North India. In Khajuraho, which has magnificent also carvings, of which only 10% go back. 10% are sort of erotic, but and the rest speak about daily life. But even that eroticism is not to be taken at face value. It is the sculptor depicting the soul's yearning for union with the ultimate God.
Yes.
So so I mean, there are our temples are totally magnificent. They tell many stories within them. Because can we move to the next? And this is, of course, the great Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjavur. It's also early 11th century. And okay, sorry, I was getting into this one. And these are the great Hoysala temples. I'm only showing one, where if you see on the right-hand side, the slide, I mean, they would have registers and panels of great wars, of great happenings. If it wasn't for for either scenes from our 2 great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, very much like the Iliad and the Odyssey, excepting they're much longer.
Yeah.
So this also became registries of history, so to speak. I mean, this is a very great tradition that we've had in our temples, and very close to this is now built by Tipu Sultan, who fought against the British actually with the French and lost. But this is his summer palace, exquisite in its detailing, and these are lower registers of that exquisite palace. And this is now, I showed north, south, east. The east, we've got the great Lingaraj temple, which is yet to become a World Heritage Site, because right now, as you know, we've got 31, now 32, which are built heritage sites. But India, with its 10,000 monuments, could have many more, out of which only 3,005, now 5,000 actually, are actually protected. The rest are under various forms of protection, and some lie unprotected altogether. So there are big debates of conservation and how it should be done in India. And this is Hampi, which, as you know, is a huge site because it was a fort. It was a fort palace. or palaces rather, with temples, or it was a capital. And here you see in the Queen's Palace on the left-hand side, you see fusion of Hindu-Islamic architecture. So here I'd like to say, Charles, that, you know, I think it's only in India where Islamic architecture totally found its own voice. It had its own vocabulary because it drew much from Hindu architecture. And later on, of course, when Indo-Saracenic architecture in the last 200 years, in places like Lucknow, in places like Chennai, Madras earlier, in places like Bombay. So everything that we kind of adapted. And I think that is the greatness of our civilization, is that eventually we made everything our own. And we were because the country is subcontinental. So I really do think that if you're studying, say, Mughal architecture, you cannot study Mughal architecture without studying the buildings that are in Lahore, because Lahore was also a great Mughal capital, as were Agra and New Delhi. So the world has become so small in so many ways that I think we have to look at these broad sweeps of culture, because we are fashioned by geographies. And our history is then fashioned by geography. But these are just recent political divisions. So I really urge a study of these buildings as for the whole subcontinent, and not just divided into where we are, or, you know, try and pigeonhole certain styles of architecture. This is also continues with Hampi, the magnificent elephant stables, and then there is Jain architecture, that's Ranakpur, which is superb. Dilwara temples, also Jain, 10th century. Then of course the Sanchi Stupa, which is 3rd century BC, and the Sanchi Stupa is the oldest Buddhist monument, whereas Borobudur, which is also magnificent and which also was really retrieved from the Malaysian forests, all these 8 tiers. So that again both these become magnificent examples of what conservation has done and what archaeology has done. Because without that, by this day and age, these would have totally been taken, would have been reduced to dust, or just some monuments left. And then this, of course, again, the British discovered Ajanta and Ellora, which was amongst the first to be given World Heritage Site status in 1983, I think. Both these and Fatehpur Sikri and the Taj came on together. And then quickly every year we had things happening. And this, of course, Kailashnath temple, which is in Ellora, is totally magnificent because it's the largest monolithic structure in the world. And the making of it is so magnificent that it actually requires a whole Zoom call on this. So we won't go into that, but they had to carve from on top, go down. So it was not just architects, there were engineers, there were dancers, there were musicians, there were priests to get it all, because it did not allow for any mistakes. So it's magnificent, and it's part of the 1863 listing. Then we've got, sorry, I go back. Then of course let's go back. Then of course we've got the 12th century, the largest Star of Victory, which is when the first wave of the Muslims came. There were Turkic tribes, and it's called the Slave Dynasty with Kutubuddin Aibak. And here in one of the inscriptions, he does say that the stones that were used for it was with the destruction of 27 Hindu and Jain temples. But it isn't that such things did not happen. They did happen, but you know, people like Aurangzeb who are reviled for what they did. Whereas Aurangzeb, actually, if you study history, and you're a historian, Charles, and you would appreciate that they gave a lot of grants for the upkeep of Hindu temples, and which is all part of recorded history. But the thing with history is that, you know, it can be, the teaching of it can be so subjective, or the exposure to that can be so subjective, depending upon what point of view one wants to take. But here we are speaking of syncretic culture. We are all liberal people. We are all deeply secular people. And certainly I can speak for myself. I'm a deeply practicing Hindu, but I grew up in a Muslim city. I studied in a Roman Catholic convent. So this is the sort of mindset, not just me, that all of us have. And this is the way I think in a country as pluralistic as ours, as multicultural as ours, I think this is the only way forward. Next.
Sunita,
yes.
the buildings that you're showing us from Delhi and from Agra, what they appear in the first instance is a manifestations of power. And I think this
Absolutely.
is something which is a really important point to make about Indian monumental architecture, is the sheer scale and size, which is sort of, is partly to intimidate, but partly to persuade.
Both.
And I'm just wondering if you like to, we're kind of nearing the end of our allotted time. I'm just wondering if you like to reflect on that side of it, and possibly the last topic of slides could illustrate that.
Okay, I think just to very quickly jump to, yes, the Mughals realized it, all earlier major dynasties realized that not only that architecture was history written in stone, but the only manifestation of power was really through its architecture.
Yes.
And the Mughals, of course, really understood it, and that's where the British took it on when they designed New Delhi. Because
Indeed.
as you will recollect, you know, there was a great debate about the style that this new city would take. And then Lord Hardinge was he very much wanted the Mughal style, because he knew what Mughal architecture had done, being an embodiment of power and a statement of empire. But he was then persuaded, and that's another story also. And eventually New Delhi became what it became, which is particularly with its main building, then Viceroy's house, and now a Rashtrapati Bhavan.
And you were involved. You were involved in doing restoration work in the Viceroy's house, were you not?
Yes, I am deeply privileged that I was not continuously, but my first involvement was in '82 when Queen Elizabeth was visiting for the Commonwealth, and then, but really substantially from 2004 to 2009, 5 years. So it's the largest palace. It was then the largest palace built in the world.
Do you want to put up the image of the Viceroy's house?
Okay, if we just get it. There's one before. This is Viceroy's house. And this also speaks of a sort of a syncretism of architectural types, because the dome that you see is taken from Sanchi. What we call the chhajjas, that is the deep eaves that you see, are taken from Mughal and Rajput architecture. The small little canopies that you see, which we call chhatris, are very much a part of Hindu architecture. And next slide. And he created what is known as the Delhi order of columns, and which added and extended the 5 Western orders on which all of Western architecture is built. And because and it had temple bells, because he saw that you have temple bells that exist in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain monuments. So he took Lachin's, please next slide.
Sunita, do you think that Lutyens, if you like, creates the most syncretic building in India?
Sorry?
That the government house in Lutyens' hands is actually the most syncretic building, simply because of the evidence of all these stylistic connections.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and it's monumental in scale, exactly. It's monumental, it's syncretic, and if there's time, there's a short quote which I want to read from what Lutyens said. Is there time to read the quote?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. So, you know, we are very fortunate that that much of what Lutyens was thinking, because he wasn't very articulate as a man, but he wrote. And in his 17 journeys, he wrote 2,500 letters to his wife. So, who was also the daughter of a former Governor General. So he wrote in one of his letters, and I'm quoting, "To express modern India in stone, to represent her amazing sense of the supernatural, with its complement of profound fatalism and enduring patience, is no easy task. This cannot be done by the almost sterile stability of the English classical style, nor can it be done by capturing Indian details and inserting their features, like hanging pictures on a wall." And I continue the quote. He says, "In giving India some new sense of architectural construction, adapted to her crafts, lies the great chance of creating what may become a new and inspirational period in the history of her art." And I tend to agree with what he did. And therefore, when people like the architectural historian Philip Davies call it a double magnificence,
Yes.
because what he brought from the West and what he took from India is something extraordinary. So it was the apotheosis of this great architect's greatest work. And I think that firstly, planning the city, and then planning and designing its principal buildings. So I rest my case for Lutyens on that. Obviously, I'm prejudiced, but rightly so, like thousands of others, because he was an amazing architect.
So your last slide will lead us arguably to the most syncretic urban space in India, which is the Central Vista.
Yes. And
so,
interestingly,
are you anxious that this space is going to be irredeemably changed, and therefore the value of its the syncretic value will be lost forever?
You know, I wouldn't call it syncretic so much. I'm not talking about the buildings now, I'm talking about the space. As I would say that this was designed for the public. This was one of the great public spaces for common people. But isn't
that also a great contradiction? Because the Vista was laid out for grand processions for the King Emperor, for the Viceroy, and yet after independence, the aerial footage which was shown of Gandhi's funeral procession, it's crowded. Yes. For the first time, it becomes an agora of democracy. It becomes a crowded space.
Absolutely, because
and that continues.
That continues, and we have taken the space and made it our own. I cannot tell you, when you look in our National Archives, incidentally also a jewel of a building designed by Lutyens, and you go through the archives, you see that the years of debate for every decision that was made regarding New Delhi's. That is after we became a republic and a democracy. So of concern to all conservationists, all architects, all urban planners is that who decides what, who makes the decisions of what to remove from the use of the public. Surely it cannot be one person's decision or a government's decision. This is where everybody who is in a similar profession or is involved in architecture and the arts, they have to come together to at least voice these things that are basically not right.
Yes. I think on that note, possibly we'll have to bring this to a close, because I can see there are a lot of questions building up, which we'll have to give time for.
Okay.
Is there anything that you wanted to ask me?
Oh, yes,
Did you
I
have any
very much
questions for
wanted.
me?
No, yes, I very much wanted to ask you. I thought you were trying to close it. Charles, I wanted to ask you two things, and what drew you to India? And I know you have a deep involvement with the Scottish cemetery and a community school around it. And together with that the British have played a significant part in the rediscovery of Buddhism in India. And so I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, so you can answer longer, shorter, whichever one. And then I know that of great interest to you is also the urban regeneration in Ahmedabad, which has been declared a World Heritage Site, a World Heritage City. And I know that one of your architects, your colleague, she gives lectures at SEPT in Ahmedabad. And maybe you'd like to throw light on these three things very quickly.
Well, I'm in a very privileged position, having been involved with a heritage project in Kolkata since 2008. But I think what I just wanted to very briefly say is that this very strong connection between Scotland and India through archaeology and the discovery and preservation of civilization, which we started this conversation with, that is continuing. And for example, Edinburgh University has an sustainable urban design course, an international master's course, which is run in India. It's been already to Mumbai, to Kolkata, and then to Ahmedabad. So if you like, the sharing of intelligence and information is still continuing, and that's very important to me. The project which we're running in Kolkata is effectively will be an urban regeneration project, and I hope that it will be seen as an experimental test bed for a lot of ideas which are coming from Scotland as well. So if you like, this infusion of thinking, this continual connection with India and Scotland is something of great importance to me, I feel. And I'm not sufficiently well traveled in India, and having seen the slideshow, now I hope very much to go and visit all the sites that you've shown. And I think we possibly can have another discussion maybe next year, after I'm a bit more familiar with many of the fantastic buildings which you've shown us. So thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you. And here I just very quickly want to add that, Charles, you and I have yet to meet. We've been, Roddy kindly introduced us, telephonically. And
but you've met my parents. You gave my
parents
your
parents. What a small world. And they came for dinner to the house.
They came to your house for the 50th anniversary of independence in 1997.
I know. So it's a small world.
You restrained my father from singing a song at the end of dinner.
Yes. But he, like Scrooge was saying, and where are the rocks? Indeed, are there any rocks? So it's wonderful, these connections that we have. We have to thank Roddy for it, because he introduced us. Roddy, I have to thank you for inviting me. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and I've so enjoyed meeting Charles.
Thank you very much.
Terrific pleasure. And I know that Doug Cook is going to manage the questions that have been building up from the other participants. And so, Doug, would you like to start doing that?
I can, Roddy. I'm going to go to Bashabi. Bashabi, can you hear me? Could you put your question, please, first? I think you made a point, and then you made a question also. Perhaps you could make both now. Thank you.
The question was something that Mukul raised about forming a kind of awareness platform for preserving the Bara, but also can we do something about stopping the developers, globally, if we could have a platform which could bring to the consciousness of the world that Lutyens Delhi was being threatened by developers. We know what developers can do, because they have really, it is not development, it is always at the cost of conservation.
Well, just very quickly, is that to me? I'll just very quickly make one point. In 1986, because of one building, because of one bungalow which had been brought down, a very ugly, this is what was Aurangzeb Road earlier, right in the heart of what is now termed as the Lachins Bungalow Zone. It was brought down, and this ugly, these ugly flats came up. The then Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, made it into law that nobody could do any changes in the Lachins Bungalow Zone. And this was something which was very difficult to circumvent. So because he knew that the real estate there is horrifically expensive, it's probably the most expensive in the world. I mean, this is from what I was told. So that at least stopped it and arrested it. Presently, the situation has not, they've not really, they can do it by law. And like what has happened in the Central Vista, if you decide to take 86 acres away from the Central Vista to make what you plan to make, all these Stalin-like office buildings up to 4 stories and not leave public spaces. So there are things, I mean, all laws can be broken. There are ways of going about it, but we just have to pray that we all, in all our respective countries, have enlightened governments who have a pluralistic mindset. That is all that one can really say. Because as you see, even what's happening in Turkey, I mean, you know, the Hagia Sophia has been now converted into a mosque for Friday prayers, and it was a museum from having been a cathedral. So wherever there's such leaders, things will happen.
Sunita, thank you.
Would you like to say something to that?
No, I've got nothing to add, I think.
Okay.
Sunita, thank you very much indeed. We have Namita, who has a question for you, and maybe Charles as well. Namita, are you there?
Sunita, my question is for you.
Yes.
I am also from Lucknow, and so I share the sentiment, many of the sentiments that you have shared today in your conversation. I'll keep the question short. Because there is so much, there is the tendency to sort of people in power to overwrite history, and architecture is a documentation of culture as well as history and an assimilation of artistic influences. I was wondering if there is a way of having a global organization which sort of has sway over, or at least has enough muscle to sort of push its sort of, you know, as protectors of art and architecture, if they can sort of come together and sort of be able to say that, you know, what needs to be protected, and so that they protect these monuments from political intervention across the world, not just India. Is it possible? Is there an organization like that?
I'm afraid not in India. Not in India. We don't have it. And so therefore, even in every city, if we take a monument by monument, I really feel that we should encourage private public partnerships. Even the Archaeological Survey should encourage that. In fact, the first one that was ever signed was signed by common citizens like us, a group of 5 people, of which there were 2 British people and 3 Indians. And this was to see what we could do for, you know, for India's 50th anniversary. So we took it upon ourselves to do all the work we took on a place called Jamali Kamali, which is near the Qutub Minar, and under Intac, and then a wonderful guy called O.P. Jain. So he gave his private time and did that. And then we took on the gardens of Humayun's tomb. And then, of course, we set the whole thing up, and then we gave it to the experts. And I have to say that after that, was the 50th anniversary was over, we also disbanded ourselves, because I'm a great believer. You don't stay on with things until you're long in the tooth. You hand it to the experts and you move on to another passion, if you want to call it, because these things only come out of passion, that you invest that sort of time or collect the monies for it. But there isn't. I wish there was in India. I wish, if you have suggestions, I'm sure Charles and I would love to hear about them and see how we can set up these things. Because look at the example of the National Trust in Britain, started by
Yes.
a woman on her kitchen table. So everything is possible.
Well, that's a fascinating example. Yeah.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for answering the question.
Not at all.
Thank you. I think we might have a question from Mukul. I don't know if you're there, Mukul. Are you there?
And Sunita, who better than you, being in Delhi and being in the kind of work that you've done over the past years? I think I know there are lots of people, lots of groups talking about it. The voices have already been raised, but nothing much is coming out of it for various reasons, which again, I don't think I need to tell you, you and I both know. So, but yeah, we need a greater and a stronger push. How do we do it is something which we need to figure out. Do you have any idea whether,
you know, unfortunately in our country, conservation and is still at a very nascent stage.
Yes.
And we have, because it takes several decades, like it has done in the West, for these to be very solidly understood. And yet, in spite of that, Charles, would you like to would you like to tell them what you told me yesterday about what happened in England after the Second World War? That in spite of having all these laws, if so to speak, in place, yet what destruction can happen of the historical fabric of a city.
Well, in Britain, there was really no protection until the late 1960s, which allowed for an extraordinary scale of devastation, like almost like the Cultural Revolution in China. And again, I think it's anyone who's participating in a debate like today from the UK has to acknowledge that. We lost over 2,000 stately homes after, in the interwar period, but primarily after the Second World War. And we lost a large expanse of really important historical townscape. But the one point I want to make is that in the end, politicians will listen to the people's voices, if you like, if they're properly articulated. And it takes us back, if you like, to this idea of how you compare the manifestation of power in architecture between intimidation and persuasion. There was one person who was absolutely key to, if you like, ushering in a new era of conservation in the United Kingdom, and that was a poet, John Betchaman, who was so aghast at the destruction of a railway station in London, Euston Station, and the imminent destruction of another railway station, St Pancras, that he managed to, if you like, galvanize public opinion. And I'm very interested, and Mukul will bear this out, in Kolkata, we have Amit Chaudhary, an internationally acclaimed writer, who's trying to galvanize public opinion in the same way as John Betchaman did.
Wonderful.
Okay.
That's really very encouraging, to know.
Yeah.
And actually, it doesn't require an archaeologist to speak up for the conservation of either urban landscapes that are important or of archaeological sites. Anybody can, because we are all a concerned citizenry. So anybody can.
It's got to become part of the public consciousness. I think this is
absolutely,
and that's why it's very important to have this discussion as we're having today, to encourage others. Yeah.
Yes.
So just sorry, how do we move forward from here, from this point? Because we already have thousands of people talking about this, but we can see their voices not being heard. How do we move forward from here?
All I can suggest is that, you know, I'll request Asia Scotland Institute maybe to give you my email address if you'd like to, and I can pass this on to people who I know are working towards addressing this, how much success anybody will have, because this is all within a political arena.
Yes.
And we have to understand that when within this political arena, the government in power has the largest number of voices in parliament, so they can really pass anything and make and almost make a mockery of trying to fulfill what needs to be done before, like heritage assessment reports and several reports like that, which need to be completed before you could begin a project like this. And this sort of unholy haste is another thing. And so let's see, there's something also coming up that somebody has put up in court, but it wasn't heard. So let's see if it's heard again. We all wait because we're all concerned. And particularly, I think at a time like this, we're in the midst of, we should never bring in COVID into this, into a discussion like this, but it is there. And particularly in our country, you know, millions have suffered because of COVID. I mean, talking about, you know, laborers. So surely a project like this with the money is involved, it should be untenable, this project at a time like this, because otherwise where is a country's soul, where is its compassion, where is its kindness? I mean, nothing is happening if this is not built, except maybe put a name to it, that it was done during so-and-so's tenure but do we require that at this time? So many people have spoken, written up, but I think it's falling on deaf ears. They're obdurate and they're determined to just push this through. And sadly, I think the architect who's working on it is, you know, heads a major institute, CEPT. So I really don't understand. I just don't understand the reasons why this is happening with so much haste. Do something. Some buildings were extremely ugly, built in the 50s, but don't just destroy. I come back to destroy the urban landscape of what is really considered one of the most beautiful capital cities in the world.
Absolutely.
So I know it's very sensitive right now. All of us, we wait, we do whatever we can. Let us see.
Spoken very well, Sunita. Thank you for your answer. And yeah, I would really like to connect with you on this. So if I can get the email ID.
Please.
We'll share that with you. Sunita and Charles, I do have a question for you, just to reflect on what's happening in the United States of America and elsewhere, of course, with monuments, with statues. It seems to me there's a tendency now to judge by today's norms things that happened in the past. And whilst the anger is understandable, in the context of what you're talking about and India, is there an element of that? This sort of drive towards modernism at the cost and expense of buildings and monuments that were created by others at another time and that carried an enormous amount of meaning. The rewriting of history, it seems to me, is a challenge. What do you both think of that?
Well, I mean, Roddy, I think just very quickly, the point that Sunita's been making about the Central Vista really is not connected to the point that you've raised. I think in India you'll find that a lot of the statues which were left behind in 1947 by the British have long since been removed. In Delhi, they've been moved to the Durbar Park and replaced with much more relevant statues indicating India's perception of its own past and the figures who should be represented. I think the concern of the rebuilding of New Delhi is more to do with the manifestation of power. It's got nothing to do with the rewriting of history. But I'll leave that to Sunita to answer.
Okay, thank you.
I totally agree with Charles. It's, I mean, the whole redevelopment plan of the Central Vista is trying to impose power, because what can one say? It's a vanity project, and to put it bluntly. And but you know, this is all. I mean, this has happened in our history before. When you just sweep away all this, you do not, because you're all powerful, you do not, you're not accountable to anybody. I mean, this has happened in Germany. It's happening in other places around the world, wherever there is this sort of brute right-wing power. So I think, I would imagine that since the world is much smaller, there would be more, you know, there would be more compassion, there would be more accountability, not just to your own countrymen, but to, say, the larger society at large. So I hope that that is what will happen one day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Doug?
Roddy, if we've got time for questions, I've had another question from Sunil. If I could ask you, if you could be very brief, please, Sunil. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, actually. What's the role of private? I mean, she mentioned that as well. Sunita had mentioned that quite rightly. I want to know more about how can we create more public-private partnerships in India with the support of the government, whatever, and get more of these sites. I mean, there are thousands. I mean, Sunita said there are 10,000 sites in India, and we have got only 32 World Heritage sites. So don't depend on World Heritage, don't depend on the government. Get realistic pricing. I mean, charging 10 rupees to enter Taj Mahal or something like that is ridiculous. People pay 200 rupees for a movie or 500 rupees for a movie. Thank you.
Is that to me?
Sunita, if you would, please. Yes, thank you. And then perhaps Charles, you could comment. Thank you.
Yes. Very quickly, I'll say that, you know, sometimes there are problems that you cannot solve on your own. And I think you should ask for international help of experts. The example I'd like to give you is of a magnificent monument in Orissa, Konarak Temple. Now, Konarak Temple, as we all know, I think it was in the early 20th century, I can't remember the exact date, 1906, 1908, they found that the central, what was the Gopuram, the Jagannath, was about to crumble. It's very close to the sea. So in their wisdom, the equivalent of, the archaeological survey then, under the experts that they had, they filled it with sand. Right now, today, there is another debate about what should be done, and they're not being able to come to it because the stone is also very light. So in that sort of situation, I think, why not ask people like UNESCO? Because UNESCO is more than World Heritage Sites. After all, look at what they did in Abu Simbel. I mean, they cut everything, they raised the blocks. So, and look what they've done in other places. So there shouldn't be the chauvinism that I know best, because sometimes we gain a lot from other people also, other exports also. And I think there are people like ICOMOS who are supposed to give this sort of advice. So there is that, and believe me, if we could do it for one monument, this private-public partnership, and that too of a World Heritage Site monuments, anybody can. And we have 5 unknown people, really, virtually. and we signed that agreement, which has become like a sort of role model. So I think it's also passion that needs to drive you. I mean, for instance, I even know the architect Karan Grover, who worked for 30 years to get Champaner, Pavagadh, which used to be the old capital of Gujarat in the 7th century, to get it listed. And he did it, and he succeeded. So I think more people, and there are thousands I know that, more people need to be driven to, because it's almost like an NGO that you might run. You have to drive it with the same sort of passion, and drive it in your own time, and without remuneration and whatever. I mean, so anybody can do it, and then if you present a proposal, it all begins from a proposal, and then keep following that up, even with the archaeological survey. After all, they've done a lot of good work also. I'm talking about the present. They've done a lot of good work, and yet there are things that they could have learned from. For instance, museology is not our strong suit. So if you take the two museums that were built by the British, one in Taxila, I think in 1918, and the one in Sarnath, 1910, they still remain little gems. Now, if you see the new museums that have been built, say at Hampi, it would destroy your mental balance, because there's aesthetically, how can I say it politely? Aesthetically, they're so poor, and here you're beside such great sites. So this is where I think, even though archaeology is becoming much stronger here, the awareness amongst civil society is becoming much more, and this is where I think we need to we need to put in everything government can't do. What is it that we are doing? Charles, would you not agree? I think private people need to come up and also give solutions, and also work towards what they believe in.
Yes, but the other point which I think is important to make is that privately owned historic buildings form a really important part of heritage townscapes all over India. And at the moment, there doesn't appear to be any incentive for private owners to restore their buildings. And often you find that municipal corporations are not setting a very good example either.
Yes.
So, I mean, it probably wouldn't amount to very much. We're talking about some probably quite minor adjustments to fiscal adjustments which need to be made to encourage owners to conserve and not allow buildings to fall down in order to release the site for redevelopment.
And here we do have some examples, like for instance, the Municipal Act in Bombay is really very strong on heritage. And they've really, I know several friends and colleagues who worked there, and they're really moving ahead. I mean, that whole old complex of what they call Kala Ghoda. And in fact, we tried to adopt, because I sat on a committee which had been set up by a former chief minister of Delhi. She sadly died, but she was a 3-term chief minister. And we tried to incorporate those municipal laws here. Because I always think, why reinvent the wheel? Why not learn from each other? Everything doesn't have...
What needs to be shown is that investment in restoring heritage buildings and heritage streetscapes will benefit everyone in the end, because all land prices will begin to rise as a result.
Absolutely.
And so there's a very strong economic argument which can easily be made too.
And there's also very strong, in a country like ours, Charles, there's also a very strong economic value for having tourism the way it should be in a country like ours, because we are such a magnificent country. We have such wondrous monuments that look at what we could just gain from tourists coming. Of course, I think even that tourism needs to be controlled. not as stringently as what Bhutan did. They would not allow more than 2,500 foreigners to come into their country because they thought they didn't want to go the way of Nepal. But within structures can be set up, and we've got so much to offer across. I think just that one industry can really be so economically beneficial to so many. And if we speak of jobs, etc., this is an industry that employs millions of people. Look at the opportunities it would create. We've got the sites, we just need the infrastructure of the industry to be built around it. And here, if you take even a small country like Sri Lanka, which has amazing sites, and during the height of their civil war, what they did was they encouraged people to come by offering very inexpensive business class tickets. And even there, if you were to go, say, from one site, say a site called Polonnaruwa, which is older than Hampi, and if you were to go to a site like Sigiriya, which are the oldest extant gardens of the subcontinent, they're 5th century, you can just go by helicopter, and it was for a very nominal fee. But people have to think things out of the box. You're in a tough situation. How do you get out of it and still make the economics of it relevant? So I think we are a very large country with very many sites. There's so much we can do.
Sunita, Charles, thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious of time, and we're probably over time already. There's a very rich commentary of really good points in the chat, which I'll try and capture later. But I have a final question, which really sort of builds on this point that you're making. And perhaps I could ask Janvi if you could put your question. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Janvi, from a student of architecture from Sri Sri Ravi Shankar University. My question is that as architects of this nation, if we take this initiative of documenting every site and making comics or making videos or making animated films about the sites, we can generate the importance of the sites in every individual's minds, so that they realize their duties towards protecting the sites. Like, can we generate this thought in mind of every citizen? That's my question.
I think you made a wonderful point. And I wish every architectural school, and of which there are about over 200 in the country, would take this up. And I know that I've been chairperson of one school, chairperson of the School of Planning and Architecture in Bhopal, and we had a very strong conservation architecture division. And they had taken on a 7th century site called Ashapuri, because Madhya Pradesh is very rich. People just hear of Rajasthan and not really Madhya Pradesh, very rich in sites. I mean, the state already has 3 World Heritage Sites. So so these architectural students, under a very, very good professor, they identified every single historical rock. So there were 27 fallen temples, and every rock was identified, and what they call, stitched 3 temples. They lay it on the ground. I mean, you're an architectural student, you know what I would be speaking about.
Yes.
So this study and all was done, but sadly, there's no continuity of then getting a grant, then erecting these temples, then restoring them. Because also in India, the unfortunate fact is that we suffer from excess of riches. We've got so much. So, there's also the thing, so what if a couple of monuments go? We've got so much else to look after. But that should not be the attitude. Because as we know, in the Delhi census itself, within 100 years, early 19th century, 20th century to early 21st century, in Delhi, I'm talking about just one city, we have already lost over 300 monuments. heritage monuments.
Can I ask just a quick point? Javi, that was one of the most important points actually raised today, the point you just raised. When we talk about conservation architecture, we're not just talking about the conservation of monuments, as Sunita has just explained. What we're talking about is the engagement of public consciousness, of connecting people and places. And all the structures and the great monuments that we've been talking about today, what they do is to define India. But what you're talking about are, if you like, looking at towns and cities all over India, where there might be an important building or an important group of buildings. Those buildings define the place where they are. And it's really important to connect people, if you like, with that idea, because that gives them a sense of their identity. And that, I'm more fearful than anything that India is at risk of losing so much of its identity as it begins to lose these really important buildings and cityscapes.
Yes. And if you lose that sort of identity, you also have a breaking down of the social unity of a city. I mean, these are, it's not original to me, but this is a known fact. So, but Charles, I want to ask you, I mean, like in Edinburgh, say, for instance, they're doing, do we have a minute, Doug? Do we have a minute?
Yeah, and then we must close out, yes.
Of course, yes.
Okay. Charles, in Scotland, in Edinburgh in particular, one has seen, there is, you know, the city has taken on this massive restoration of what is called the New Town. How are similar practices applicable in India? Because, you know, we should really think of people to people, I mean, city to city. I know that Edinburgh, for instance, was twinned with New Delhi. So I don't know what has happened to that scheme, because that twinning took place by the chief minister had mentioned earlier, Mrs. Dixit. So, so that each city, the twinned cities can learn from each other's practices or what they're doing right. You all obviously are, we all obviously aren't. And maybe in some other things, we may be doing the right thing and we could maybe, you know, we could share information.
Yes, indeed. I think the important point to recognize is that Edinburgh is a very small place in comparison to cities in India. The population is under 400,000. And the other point to make is that the new town was threatened with partial demolition.
Yes.
Which goes back to the point I was making earlier, in the 1960s, as recently as that. But what has happened is that Edinburgh is one of the world's first World Heritage Cities, and it has a conservation trust, which runs, if you like, takes on the responsibility for managing that status. That's something which may be applicable. And the other thing which Edinburgh has benefited from is a very strong presumption against high buildings. And that has allowed the skyline to remain intact. However, there aren't enough hotel bedrooms as a result. And so the controversy at the moment is trying to find sufficient space within the city centre where new hotels can be built.
Thank you. Okay, Doug, I think I should now close the event. Is that right?
Yes, please, Roddy, if you would. Thank you.
So, Sunita and Charles, thank you both so much for what's been clearly regarded as a fascinating discussion. As you've been talking, as I sit here now in the new town in Edinburgh, I can tell you that defending heritage. We've got someone competing with me, never mind, I'll keep going. Defending our heritage. But I also have thought, and the Asia Scotland Trust, another entity, has been set up to really promote the joint heritage enjoyed by Scotland and Asia. But as we have talked, I've been thinking of the restoration of Petersburg and the remarkable things done by the Russians
Yes.
under Putin and others to celebrate their heritage. Controlling of the relationship between modern architectural needs and respect for our history and heritage is a very delicate balance, and it is something that we should continue to look at from the Asia Scotland Institute, and we will come back to this topic again. Raising awareness and empowering people to take control of what is theirs and ensure that this is not destroyed by short-termist developments is critically important. So on that basis, thank you so much for the time you devoted to talking to us. Sunita and Charles, for sharing your thoughts and obviously inspiring and generating questions from others. And I look forward very much to building on what we have heard discussed today at the Asia Scotland Institute. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Roddy, for inviting me, and thank you, Charles, for our conversation together. It's been most enjoyable, and I have to say that I always, whatever the Asia Scotland Institute is involved in is always interesting and is educative. Even for me, this was educative. So I might be one of the participants speaking, but so what? But thank you, Roddy, again. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Doug.
Bless you. Thank you. Thanks, Charles, again. And Doug, do you want to sign us off?
Well, no, I'd like to say thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, really interesting, and some super comments in the commentary. So I will try and capture those, and I'll put those up on the website as well. But thank you very much for all the participants, but particularly to our speakers. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.